My Lord Inquisitor, further to the efforts of cooperation between the Logos Historica Vertia and the Ordo Theoreticus, please find appended the requested record. I wish you good health, good fortune, and as ever, I am your most humble of servants. Sincerely, Oculus Imperia. The Farsight Expedition was a military campaign conducted by the Tau Empire, which sought to reclaim the worlds that had been lost to the Imperium during the course of the Damocles Crusade. The timing of this expedition would prove fortuitous for the Tau Empire, as the Imperium had been forced to divert much of its military assets to combat against the encroaching forces of High Fleet Behemoth, whose arrival into the galaxy would lead to the events of the First Tyrannic War. Because of this, the Farsight Expedition, led by none other than Commander Farsight himself, would prove successful in recapturing a number of worlds that now lay within Imperial hands, thanks in part to such worlds only being lightly garrisoned, although what Imperial forces did remain would nevertheless prove to be a stubborn and vicious foe. Those worlds that had been retaken by the Tau would form the core of what would eventually become known to be the Farsight Enclaves. Eventually, as the expedition reached the far side of the Damocles Gulf, the Tau would begin encountering an ever-increasing number of orcs throughout the region, resulting in Farsight's forces coming into conflict with greenskins with an ever-increasing frequency. Despite needing to only recapture the world of Illuminas in order to complete his mission, Farsight would turn his attentions towards an orc empire ruled by the war boss Grog Ironteeth, which had been conducting numerous raids throughout the region. Deeming the greenskins to be a far greater threat to the Enclaves than the Imperium of Man, Farsight would order for his fleet to begin a systematic purge of the orc threat. Such a decision would prove to be highly controversial, as it would result in Farsight disobeying the instructions of the Ethereal Council, an act that many throughout the Tau Empire would deem to be almost unthinkable. Despite this, Farsight would nevertheless go ahead with his genocidal campaign. When Ironteeth's forces invaded the world of Atari Vo, the Tau would appear to finally prove victorious against the Greenskins after what had been a long and costly campaign. It would be revealed that Farsight had made a mistake in underestimating his foes. Following his return to the Enclaves, he would discover that the worlds had been completely overrun by the orcs. Eventually, however, thanks to his unconventional tactics, the Enclave worlds would be in time purged of the Greenskin menace. As the orcish threat was systematically eliminated from each of the Farsight worlds, the commander's forces would eventually make their way to the world of Arthas Moloch, an ancient, long-dead world, which the orcs had invaded seemingly in search of plunder. The Tau would track a large number of orcs to the grounds of what appeared to be an ancient temple, which would result in a fierce firefight erupting between the two forces. As the battle raged on, the blood of the slain would begin to pool and flow around a large circular dais situated within the center of the temple complex. Little did the Tau realize that they were in the midst of performing an inadvertent blood sacrifice, for as the orcs were gunned down by Farsight's forces, spilling more and more blood around the dais, a portal into the very realm of chaos itself would be opened, before beginning to disgorge a legion of demonic entities. The demons would attack both the orcs and the Tau with equal fervor and ferocity, and soon Farsight found himself in the crosshairs of a bloodthirster, a greater demon of Cahorn. Despite attempting to fend off the demon with the immense firepower of his XV8 battlesuit, Farsight would find himself being utterly overwhelmed by the sheer ferocity of the creature, which came close to killing him. In desperation, Farsight would take up a large sword that was being held by one of the many statues erected throughout the temple grounds, before using it to block against the demon's axe as it descended in the executioner's arc. To Farsight's surprise, the mysterious sword that he now wielded, known as the Dawn Blade, not only deflected the blow, but cut through the demonic weapon as if it was nothing but air. Not only this, but the sword would even carve through the iron-hard flesh of the bloodthirster with little resistance, severing the demon's hand at the wrist. Now having gained his second wind, Farsight would re-enter the fray, despite the injuries that he had suffered. After realizing that the portal was somehow linked to the various talismans held by the surrounding statues, which the demons sought to actively avoid, Farsight would have his men retrieve a number of these artifacts, before casting them into the very heart of the warp rift. The portal, which had also been deprived of the blood required to sustain it, thanks to the Tau making extensive use of incendiary weaponry to prevent any more from being spilled, would then collapse in upon itself, resulting in the demonic hordes being banished back to the depths of the Immaterium. The Tau would then proceed to eliminate the remaining orcs upon the world, with Farsight alone slaying dozens of the greenskins with his new blade. With each orc cut down by the Dawnblade, Farsight would be slowly healed of his wounds, and eventually restored to his physical prime. While the Tau would ultimately achieve victory, the 3 members of the ethereal caste that had accompanied the Farsight Expedition were revealed to have been slain by the demons. Nonetheless, Farsight would come to adopt the Dawnblade as his signature weapon, utilizing its keen edge and anomalous properties to slay countless foes upon the battlefield. Little does Farsight realize that, thanks to the unique properties of the sword, his lifespan has been extended far beyond what is natural for a Tau, effectively rendering him, for lack of a better term, biologically immortal. But what exactly is the Dawnblade? Given the extreme age of it, combined with being constructed by some sort of chronophagic alloy, some have suggested that the weapon is an artifact of the ancient Necron tier empire. Such an idea would initially appear to be somewhat feasible, as the Necron tier are known to have produced many pieces of technology, such as the chronometron or the time-splinter cloak, that are capable of manipulating the very fabric of time and space. In addition, a number of Necron dynasties have access to fully fledged temporal transporters, which are capable of sending those who enter them backwards or even forwards in time. Since the Dawnblade has been forged from materials that would allow it to effectively transfer the lifespan of those it slays onto the wielder, which allows those who wield the Dawnblade to live longer and longer with every kill they make, then it would certainly appear to be somewhat probable, at least initially, for such a weapon to have been forged by Necron chronomancers. Despite this, such a possibility would ultimately appear to be somewhat unlikely. This is due in part, primarily, to where the Dawnblade was found. As mentioned earlier, the Dawnblade was being held by a statue in the grounds of an ancient, pre-human temple upon the world of Arthas Moloch, which many of the other statues being adorned with hexagrammatic talismans. Typically, hexagrammatic wards and talismans are utilized by those individuals that demonstrate some form of psychic capability, granting such beings a measure of protection from the attentions of demonic entities. Not only this, but as detailed within the novel Farsight Empire of Lies, the architecture throughout the complex was described as being replete with similar patterns. The human psyker, Vaikola Herat, who at the time had a demonic entity parasitically dwelling within her, could not only sense the immense psychic power emanating from these wards, but the demon within her was shown to be actively despising of such patterns. Indeed, Herat would even go on to note that these hexagrammatic wards held some sort of arcane significance. While the technology of the Necrons was noted as being incredibly advanced, it was typically not designed to interact with or repel the energies of the warp in any meaningful way. While many Necron structures are theoretically capable of repelling warp-based energies, thanks to being comprised of the material known as Noctilith, or Blackstone, which, when correctly polarized, acts as a type of warp inhibitor, the temple structure found on Arthas Moloch was not comprised of such a substance, but was instead constructed from what was described as a white stone-like substance. In addition, those melee weapons commonly utilized by Necron warriors, such as hyperphase swords or war scythes, will typically sport a blade that displays a dark greenish-black tint to its construction, whereas the Dawnblade, by contrast, is a pristine silver. As such, while admittedly not impossible, it would appear incredibly unlikely for the Dawnblade to have been forged by the Necron tier. Second possibility regarding it is that the weapon is in fact the last of an ancient series of weapons known as the Crone Swords. According to Aeldari mythology, the goddess Morai Heg would have Kayla Mensha Cain, the god of war, sever her hand at the wrist, so that she would drink deep of her own blood and obtain the knowledge that flowed through her own veins. Morai Heg's hand would be taken by Vol, the god of the forge, who would fashion each of her fingers into a keen-edged blade, which wielded power over life and death itself. The Aeldari faction known as the Inari, worshippers of the nascent god Yenade, the god of the dead, believe that by recovering all 5 of these crone swords, they will be able to fully awaken their patron deity without having to sacrifice the lives of all Aeldari. So far, the Inari have recovered 4 of the 5 crone swords. Kavir, the Sword of Sorrows, which can turn its victims to ash; Asuvar, the Sword of Silent Screams, whose edge drains its victims of their very life force; the Spear of Twilight, a shape-shifting blade that can burn away the soul of any struck by it; and Vilet Zar, the largest and most powerful of the swords, which is now wielded by the Incarn, the very avatar of Yenade himself. Much like the crone swords, the Dawn Blade, as mentioned earlier, has shown to display its own unique power over life and death, with every kill being made by the blade being used to further extend the wielder's lifespan. In addition, the temple which housed the Dawn Blade held a number of statues which depicted tall, humanoid figures. While Empire of Lies describes these beings as, for lack of a better term, faceless, it's entirely possible that these statues were meant to depict the gods of the Aeldari, only for their features to have been worn away by the passage of time. What makes the idea of the Dawnblade being the 5th and final crone sword incredibly unlikely, to the point of being impossible, is that the last of the crone swords has supposedly already been recovered, although not by the Inari. According to the book Psychic Awakening, Phoenix Rising, the demon known as Shalaxi Hellbane would retrieve the final crone sword from the world of Belial IV and lock it away within the palace of Slanesh, thus making it impossible for the Inari to ever recover it. However, whether or not Hellbane ever truly obtained the last crone sword is a matter for debate, for according to the Path of the Inari novel series, the Inari are still searching for their final crone sword, which would appear to contradict the events of Phoenix Rising. Despite this, the odds of the Dawnblade being a crone sword remain, at this time, astronomically low. Alternatively, perhaps the Dawnblade was a different weapon that had been supposedly forged by the Aeldari gods. With this in mind, would it be possible that the Dawnblade is in fact none other than the legendary Anaris? According to the Aeldari, prior to the cataclysmic event of the Fall, Kayla Mensha Cain would learn from Lilith, the goddess of dreams, that the mortal children of Isha, the goddess of healing, and of Kurnos, the god of the hunt, would one day destroy the god of war. To prevent this, Cain would proceed to trap and systematically slaughter thousands upon thousands of Aeldari, resulting in Isha begging Azorian, the Phoenix King and ruler of the Aeldari pantheon, for aid. Azorian would erect a barrier between the realms of gods and mortals, declaring that no god would ever interact or communicate with the Aeldari ever again. Unable to bear the pain of being separated from her children, Isha would approach Vol for help. The smith god would forge the tears of Isha into the first spirit stones, through which Isha would then speak with her children, teaching them how to cultivate the land for farming, whilst Kurnos instructed the Aeldari in how to hunt game. Cain would one day discover Isha in communion with her children, and upon informing Azorian, the Phoenix King would state that Cain was now free to do whatever he wished to Isha and Kurnos, due to them having broken his laws. Cain would then imprison and torture the two gods for his amusement, with many of the other gods believing that Cain was going too far with his punishments, although they remained too fearful or otherwise refused to speak in their defense. Eventually, Cain would strike a bargain with Vol, who had appealed for the release of his friends. In exchange for granting them their freedom, Vol would forge 100 swords for the war god, and Cain gave Vol but a single year to accomplish his task. However, Vol would only manage to complete 99 of these blades before the deadline, and so to hide this fact, he would conceal a single sword forged by mortal hands amongst those he had forged himself. Initially, Cain would fail to spot this deception, and would honor his end of the bargain to free Isha and Kurnos. However, in time, he would discover Vol's ruse, and in his rage would hunt down the Smith God, leading to a full-scale war erupting between the Aeldari pantheon. Although Azurian, feeling responsible for this turn of events, would refuse to take sides during the conflict. Vol would then reforge the final swords that he had failed to finish for Cain, transforming it into the single greatest weapon that he would ever make, Anaris, the Sword of Dawnlight. Despite being armed with such a mighty weapon, Vol would prove to be no match for Cain in combat, the war god swiftly defeating the god of the Forge, crippling him and chaining him to his own anvil, before claiming Anaris for himself. However, as detailed within the 8th edition Craftworld Codex, Anaris would be retrieved by Fealchu, the consort of the Great Hawk, who would gift the sword to the ancient Aeldari hero Eldanesh for him to wield in his duel against Cain, although Eldanesh would himself be slain by the war god. Despite the story of Eldanesh being considered little more than myth by many, the hero did indeed exist, for as detailed in the novel Ghost Warrior, his tomb was discovered by the forces of the Inari. Because of this, it's certainly possible that sometime after the death of Eldanesh, Anaris would be taken and effectively enshrined within a temple dedicated to his memory somewhere within the galaxy, before being taken up by Commander Farsight millions of years later. After all, both swords are described as being incredibly powerful, and even share similar names, with Farsight's sword being known as the Dawnblade, and Anaris meaning Dawnlight. If Anaris is indeed the Dawnblade, then whether it was truly forged by a god or was in fact created by another powerful entity, such as the mysterious beings known as the Old Ones, is another matter entirely. The idea that the Dawnblade was constructed by the Old Ones, the progenitors of the Aeldari themselves, would also appear to be a fairly reasonable assumption, given the Old Ones were described as having constructed many great works of psychic engineering. Indeed, the temple complex that houses the weapon, as mentioned earlier, was described as being replete with hexagrammatic wards, which themselves are at least somewhat psychic by nature, imbuing the surrounding structure with arcane energies. Since the Old Ones were known to be immensely powerful psykers, such wards would have potentially been able to repel malicious warp entities, such as the Enslavers, allowing the Old Ones to utilize their abilities with relative safety. Not only this, but some of the technological marvels of the Old Ones that were known to have been created, in a manner similar to that of the Dawnblade itself, are capable of essentially reversing the aging process and restoring an individual to their physical prime. The most notable example of this is in regard to the subspace network known as the Webway. Not only can the Webway be used to travel across the vast expanse of the galaxy at incredible speeds, rendering a journey that may take several centuries in real space one that can be completed in only a few days, but it has also been shown to reverse the aging process of those that utilize it. As shown within the novel Atlas Infernal, the human inquisitor Bronislaw Savek, at least 400 years of age, would enter the depths of the Webway as a frail and decrepit old man on the verge of death. However, the Inquisitor would emerge back into real space over 30 years later, now sporting the body of a younger and much healthier man. Indeed, Savek himself would even speculate that it was because of the Aeldari's extensive use of the Webway technology that allowed the species to have such incredibly long lifespans, as they would effectively be experiencing cellular regeneration every time they entered its depths. It would not have been entirely unfeasible for the Old Ones to have forged a blade to display similar properties. However, if the Dawnblade, and by extension the temple complex on Arthas Moloch that housed it, was in fact constructed by the Old Ones, then why would such a structure house a warp gate that required blood sacrifice to open? Little information exists for certain regarding the culture of the Old Ones themselves, and as such it's certainly possible that ritualistic bloodletting may have been a part of their society, although there is no way of knowing with any degree of certainty. Alternatively, perhaps a gate was constructed later, perhaps by one of the ancient Aeldari pleasure cults that existed prior to the fall. Or maybe the temple complex itself was commandeered by some sort of chaos cult long after the original settlers of Arthas Moloch had died away. But then again, perhaps the Dawnblade is entirely unconnected to the Aeldari, the Old Ones, or even the Necron tier, and was forged by an altogether different and now long extinct race. We may never know for certain. What do you think? Leave a comment below, and as always, thanks for watching.